So we've talked about Locke's concept, and what's been developed in the West, in the United States, is the idea of government by consent. And this is, of course, adopted by Jefferson, that just or legitimate government comes from the consent of the governed in the Declaration of Independence. But Jefferson's argument in the Declaration of Independence is that this government of Britain no longer has the consent of the people, and that being the case, since it's overstepped its bounds, the people withdraw their consent and are able to alter or abolish it as their right. Now, we'll get to Jefferson later, but I want to talk about critique of the concept of consent as it's used with regard to government, and talk about how this area of consent, or what's called the social contract euphemistically, is never applied this way in real life. If people applied contracts or consent this way, they would be guilty of criminal activity, quite simply. That if they said that others consented to these things, we would not recognize that as legitimate. Yet there's this separate category, it seems, in thinking for government. And what we're asking is, should there be? Is there a good reason for there to be? Or we should also ask, is government under the same ethical rules as everybody else? And that's a key question that we have to define. But we have to look also at the dangers of democracy, not just the benefits. Now, I ask some questions here to think about. Have you ever heard of a critique of democracy? It's not popular in the West, in the United States, and this is not coming to it from a revisionist type of thing where democracy is the enemy or something like that. The point is just to think carefully and think thoroughly about the concept of democracy, where it's good and where it's not good, and why or why not there are limits, and what those ought to or ought not to be. What are some potential challenges or problems of a democracy? I've brought this up in previous videos, that your rights can be a vote away, that we don't know that the minority has necessarily consented to the system just because they voted. A majority may want to do something terrible. A majority is not necessarily even a majority all the time either. A majority just means the majority of the people who happen to vote at that time. There's also the euphemistic language, as I mentioned, of the social contract. This has been used. I used it myself in the past, that we obey government because, like Locke or Hobbes said, we kind of all entered into this social contract by simultaneous, spontaneous agreement in which we decided a government would be better than the condition we had in this theoretical state of nature. So we agreed to this thing called the social contract. That being said, that's not a historical event. There's not a document called the social contract that any of us signed or had the chance to sign. Our local government, when we reach 18 or the age of majority or become an adult, does not come knocking on our door and saying, you are now at the age of majority, you are now legally recognized as an adult. Do you consent to this government? Yes or no? And we're able to give our answer. And if it's yes, then we consent to the laws and all that comes with that, and the taxes and whatever it may be, and have access to the services or protection or whatever. But if it's no, then consent would mandate that the government leave you alone. Now, Locke's argument was, well, this would be impossible. This would be inconvenient to really get everybody to show up to give their consent to the government. So what we really mean is the consent of the majority. But my question and critique of that is, what if the majority consents together to do something terrible to a minority group? What if a majority of people vote to enslave a minority? What if a majority vote to rob someone? What if a majority vote to gang rape someone? I mean, there are all kinds of, and they, of course, I'm going to extremes, but you see the difference between a majority and a mob is not as far off as people think. The negative aspect of a democracy is ochlocracy. It is mob rule. It is the idea that just because a majority happens to vote for something, that it gives legitimacy to whatever actions it might take, even if those be terrible criminal activity. And that brings the other question in as well. Are governments under the same moral, ethical laws as the rest of us? Or do the people in governments, because governments are not run by angels, they're run by people, they're run by fallen humanity. And should those people be held accountable to the same laws, rules, and rights and limits as everyone else? Granted, they may be given authority, but authority, human authority, always has inherent, built-in limits. And so the question is, when did you sign the social contract? No one ever signed the social contract. So this idea of government by consent, it's not as strong in the idea of just a majority at one time consented. Well, what if you didn't? What if you don't now? Just because a majority now or even in the past consented does not mean that the government in all its actions whatsoever operates under the pure consent of the governed. How would you even know what that is? If people are not free to say no, if people are not free to opt out, we don't necessarily determine that because they're not free that they have approved of whatever happens to them or that they have consented, just like Saddam Hussein. 95% of the people voted for him, but that doesn't, what else are they going to do? There's no one else on the ballot. They're voting out of intimidation, of government harming them, harming their families, tracking them. Do we say, well, they consented because they voted? That's an extreme example, but we ought to apply the same consistent standard, whatever our standard is, to all governments. Should the majority rule in all cases whatsoever? As I've just mentioned, there could be problems with that. Should there be any limits to the majority rule? And should majorities be limited? Is it fair to put limits on what a popular majority decides? Can a democratic government ever do anything wrong as long as people legitimately voted? Let's say they're not voting under duress, they're not voting under coercion like Saddam Hussein, but people vote for something. Can that thing be wrong if enough people have approved of it? These are questions we have to think of carefully. Let me give some common statements that are given for how do we know when someone has consented to the government? Absent a true contract where someone signs, you verbally say yes or no, how do we know whether people have consented to the government or not? And here are three reasons that people usually give. There could be more than these, but here are I think the three that people come up with. One is that people don't leave. You live here, so you consent. Two is that people follow the laws, and three is that they use government services. John Locke actually argues similarly along these lines. But I think there are some issues with these things as well. Number one, vote with your feet. If you don't like the system, if you say you don't consent, you don't like the government, you don't appreciate what it does, get out, then leave. Okay? And we see kind of where that's coming from. But what we have to answer is with regard to what's called burden of proof. Who is the one who has to prove their case? When a thief breaks into my house, I don't feel the need to prove that my belongings belong to me. The burden of proof would be on someone else. You see, of course, in this extreme theoretical example. But who needs to prove their case? The person who says, wait a minute, you told me I was in a government by consent, and I'm not the one who wants to force anybody to do anything or not to do anything. I just want to be left alone. I just want to live peacefully. I just want to live my life and interact freely with others who want to interact with me. And you said that the government operates on the consent, but I don't consent. Let me opt out. And they say, no. And if you don't like it, you can leave. And if you stay and you don't follow what you say you have not consented to, you will be punished. Fines, imprisonment, or even death. If you resist a government hard enough, it can and will kill you. And so this individual's stuck. Vote with your feet. If you don't like it, then leave. Okay, so if you don't like America, then get out, is the argument here. But is that really a fair argument? Here's another thing to think about. If we're talking about, okay, well, we live in a society by social contract and these things. The social contract, I want you to think about how contracts work. If person A wants to make a contract with person B, and they start talking, person B can say yes or no thank you. They can sign the contract, they can reject the contract. And the contract's not enforceable until person B agrees to the contract. But here's the situation with regard to consent and the social contract. Person A wants person B to sign this business contract and says, you're going to have to follow the stipulations of the contract, and the only way you can get out of it is move to China. That's the only way you can get out of it. You have to go to another country. You're bound. You're going to have to pay. You're going to be punished if you don't pay. You're going to have to follow the rules and guidelines of the contract. You're going to have to follow the regulations of the contract. All these things will be done to you, and you have these responsibilities. But the person says, wait a minute, I didn't agree. You said I had to agree. I didn't sign anything. I'm saying no, which means that as a peaceful individual, I have the right via you to be left alone. But he says, no, you must follow this contract, and the only way you can get out of it is leaving the country. What kind of contract is that? There is no contract like that. I've never heard of a contract that exists in that way. And so that's something to think about. When it says we consented to the government, well, if you don't like it, leave. Well, hang on a second. We're telling that person that they've consented, and they're saying that they haven't. And then when they bring up no is not consent, we say, well, that's how it is around here. Leave because you don't agree to this contract. I think that's dubious reasoning. That wouldn't hold up in a court of law as far as a business contract or any other earthly contract that we can think of. Why would it hold up anywhere else? Why is it different when we apply it to government? Number two, so you follow the laws. You know you consent to the government because you follow the laws. Okay, well, you could follow the laws because you think they're really good ideas. You go a certain speed on the freeway because of safety or fuel efficiency or whatever the case may be. You wear a seatbelt because it's a good idea. All this stuff because the laws, you have consented because the laws are made over you. You follow the laws. You're part of the system, so you decide to follow them. But here's the problem with that. Just because someone follows the laws doesn't necessarily mean that they've consented to the system. If that person does not decide to leave, that doesn't necessarily mean they've consented, because what happens if they don't follow the laws? Well, they'll be sanctioned. They'll be punished. They'll be fined. They'll be imprisoned. And so how do you know whether someone is following laws because the laws are approved of and consented of, or because of the threat of coercion? Violence or the threat of violence will ensue if you do not do X. And so, how do you know? I'm not sure that you can. Number three, the reception of government services. Well, you take from the government, you use government services, you have the benefits of tax money, you drive on the roads, is the argument I call this one. That, hey, wait a minute, you can't say you don't consent to the government, you can't criticize the government because you drive on the roads. But think about that logic. Is that really fair? That because someone uses a government service over which government taxes in a monopolistic way, that there are no alternatives, that whatever the government does is legitimate because it builds roads? The government could commit horrible crimes against anybody, but as long as they provide roads that people drive on, everything's up for grabs, everything's all game. That just if by laying asphalt, by taking money from people by coercion to lay asphalt and allowing for no alternatives for people to drive on anything but that asphalt that's been laid, a government may legitimately do anything? Is that the argument? No, I mean, most people would say that's not true, but I think that is the thinking if we follow it through consistently to its conclusion. Because the idea is this: do you have alternatives to drive on the road? What do you drive on? You can't drive on the sidewalk. The roads you had to pay for through tax money. You couldn't say no thank you to your taxes. And so you had to pay for it. And so if you already had to pay for it, why wouldn't you use it? Not like you have a lot of options. And so if it's already been taken out of your paycheck and roads are part of the result of what government does, you use it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you've given your then approval to anything government does. What if government starts enslaving people? Well, hang on, the slaves use the roads, so therefore they've approved to the government. It just doesn't work, right? And of course, I like to use extremes, but I think extremes get to the point of showing whether an argument breaks or whether it's consistent. That if something is truly logically consistent, then it should apply in all cases. And exceptions could be dealt with. So how do we know when someone's really consented to the government? And this is what we're going to look at with this critique of consent and critique of Locke's view and the view that's prominent in America and in the West, that we operate under a government by consent. Is consent, and I'm not saying there isn't legitimacy to it, but is consent really the category in which we should be thinking about government? Is it that the only legitimate category is that of consent, and that's the thinking that we should apply toward government? Or are there other categories in which to think of government? So this is some philosophy that we have to consider. What would it take for someone to legitimately demonstrate without force, without fraud, without coercion, that they have consented to the government?